So the Ukrainians have very little ability to move. They have very little mobility. And at the same time, the Russians have these powerful glide bombs and lots of them that they can pound the Ukrainian soldiers and military structures with. So the Ukrainians are in deep, deep trouble.
Recently, John Mearsheimer was on Judging Freedom to talk about the current status of the war in Ukraine, why Russia's making large inroads militarily, what the Trump administration's doing, and why tensions seem to have risen with Vladimir Putin recently. So let's watch and let's react.
Over the past week, German Chancellor Merz announced that the Germans would be sending Taurus missiles in the next few weeks to Kyiv. Some of our military guys have said that's military jargon for we sent them a few weeks ago. There are no geographic limits on the ability of the Ukrainians to use these missiles. Is this going to make Germany a in the minds of the Kremlin, or is it going to make NATO in the minds of the Kremlin a co-belligerent?
Well, in the minds of the Kremlin, NATO is already a co-belligerent. And the most dangerous state here, from the Russian point of view, is obviously the United States, not Germany. So in a very important way, this doesn't change much. I find it hard to figure out exactly what the Germans are saying. They have basically walked back what Merz said. And it's not clear to me that we've delivered, or the Germans have delivered, Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, or that there's any reasonable chance they're going to be used soon. That may come down the road, who knows? But I don't see any fundamental change at this point.
Yeah, I think Mearsheimer hits the nail on the head here. NATO has been viewed as a belligerent for a long time by the Russians, as with the United States, which essentially carries the banner for NATO, and without which this war could not be bankrolled. I think Lavrov and the Russian ministry knows that these pledges that the European leaders are making, there's not going to be follow through if they don't have the U.S. with them in this endeavor. They're not going to commit soldiers either. So I mostly see this as status quo, just like John does.
Here's what he said. It's an AI translation into English, which purports to be his actual voice, or the AI construction of his voice. Number 7, Chris.
There are no longer any range restrictions on weapons delivered to Ukraine, neither from the British, nor the French, nor from us, nor from the Americans. This means that Ukraine can now also defend itself, including, for example, by taking actions such as attacking military positions located within Russia, or by targeting other strategic sites as necessary.
By the way, that would not be Ukraine defending itself. That would be the U.S. treating Ukraine as the pawn on the chessboard, giving it weapons to quote-unquote defend itself, and historically it's given them weapons that can be used for offensive purposes too, like the Aegis missile system, even before Putin invaded.
Until recently it was not able to do that. Until recently, with very few exceptions, it also did not do that. Now it can. In jargon, we call this long-range fire, meaning equipping Ukraine with weapons that can attack military targets in the rear. And this is the crucial qualitative difference in Ukraine's conduct of the war. Russia attacks civilian targets completely ruthlessly, bombing cities, kindergartens, hospitals, and nursing homes. Ukraine does not do that. And we place great importance on ensuring that it stays that way. But a country that can only confront an aggressor on its own territory is not defending itself adequately. So, and this defense of Ukraine is now also taking place against military infrastructure on Russian territory.
Put aside the accuracy or inaccuracy of his depiction of the of the Russian military. Are you saying that his own defense minister has walked back that rather definitive and clear statement about what the Germans plan to send to Ukraine?
I don't think it was rather clear or definitive. I mean, he said that Ukraine now has permission to use missiles to hit targets inside of Russia. But as he pointed out, if you listen carefully, the Ukrainians have already been doing that. This wouldn't be the first time that happened. Remember, they were allowed to hit targets inside of Russia with ATACMS. So this is nothing new. And with regard to the Taurus missiles, he didn't say anything about the Taurus missiles. And then on top of that, his comments were clarified later by other individuals in the government. And it's quite clear the Germans are not making a radical change or offering a radical change in policy here.
Yeah, that's exactly accurate. And the contradiction here is striking because Ukraine has used long-range missiles and drones actually to attack targets in Moscow, the capital. So this is just completely inaccurate. You can read it any of many ways, but the facts are that Ukraine has been doing this a long time, including targets in Moscow and other cities. So that was garbage.
I think this is a lot to do about nothing.
Fox News is just reporting that President Putin has amassed 50,000 troops on Ukraine's north front. The Guardian reported this 2 days ago. When I asked Colonel McGregor about it, he said the Guardian's numbers are off. It's more like 100,000 troops. What does this tell you?
Well, I don't know about those exact numbers in that particular location. I've been looking at the numbers overall. And my guess, based on a RUSI report from February, this is the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which is a pro-Ukrainian outlet. They say that the Russians have about 580,000 combat troops in Ukraine. That's 580,000.
Wow.
They say that the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian security forces are comprised of about 800,000 troops. However, they say less than 25% of those 800,000 troops are combat troops. So let's assume the number's 20%. 20% of the 800,000 are combat troops. That's 160,000. So that means 160,000 combat troops in the Ukrainian military up against 580,000 combat troops in the Russian military. That's a 4-to-1 overall advantage. Let's say that I'm not being fair enough to the Ukrainians here. And let's just drop the ratio down to 3-to-1. A 3-to-1 overall ratio, Russian to Ukrainian forces, is a staggering disadvantage for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, if you read the RUSI story, it says that various points along the front lines, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-to-1 in some places, 2-to-1 in other places. And there are all sorts of other sources that say there are points along the line that the Ukrainians don't have enough manpower to defend. And that what they're doing is defending those open spaces with drones. This is an army that's in terrible shape.
Are they in imminent danger of collapse, the Ukrainian military?
It's very hard to say, given the limited information that we have on the outside. But if they collapsed in 2 weeks, it would not be surprising, just given those numbers. And I could take this a step further and talk about what the Russians are doing with glide bombs, what they're doing with drones, and so forth and so on. And the situation in terms of the raw numbers looks even worse.
Yeah, and even if you doubt some of these ratios about how many soldiers are serving on the Ukrainian side versus the Russian side, if it wasn't skewed and disproportionate, why, one, would Russia have been able to occupy the territory that Zelensky fought so hard, not only to attack in 2014 in the Donbass region? You know, the fighting was supposed to be settled by the Minsk Accords, which weren't enforced by essentially either side, but Zelensky just continued fighting there. And why would Zelensky be so desperate to expand conscription mandates? It doesn't make sense unless there is severe disadvantages. So I think he's right. I think the casualty numbers from the propaganda outlets on both sides might be skewed, but some places project that over 1 million Ukrainians have actually died. Some people think as many as maybe 1.5. You know, it's hard to know between soldiers and civilians, but there's no doubt that this Ukrainian army is in disarray. That's why Zelensky the whole time has been calling for no-fly zones and NATO membership, which would guarantee, you know, the influx of many more soldiers. It just doesn't make sense. They are losing, and Zelensky doesn't have the cards. Trump was right about that. But he's still going to push for Istanbul Plus, despite the fact he cannot get the Donbass back.
What are glide bombs and what are they doing with them?
Well, glide bombs are smart bombs. They're bombs that are launched from a distance from an aircraft. And basically what the Russians can do is put these glide bombs in the pickle barrel. And what the Russians can do with their drones is they can identify where all the structures are that the Ukrainians rely on the front lines and behind the front lines. They can figure out where the troops are concentrated. And then they stand off and they launch these glide bombs, which have a huge yield, and they end up destroying structures and killing all sorts of people. Now, what the Ukrainians do in these cases is they try to move when they see the bombs beginning to hit. They try to move. But the problem with movement up on the front lines is that their drones saturating the air. And if you start moving, the drones get you. So the Ukrainians have very little ability to move. They have very little mobility. And at the same time, the Russians have these powerful glide bombs and lots of them that they can pound the Ukrainian soldiers and military structures with. So the Ukrainians are in deep, deep trouble.
Are you the only person on the faculty of the University of Chicago who uses a phrase like pickle barrel?
I would assume that's the case.
Okay. All right. What is your take on the attempted assassination of President Putin by drone and President Trump's denial that he knew anything about it? A, is the denial credible? B, is it more likely than not that Western intel, CIA, MI6, Mossad, advised where Putin was going to be at any given moment?
I find it hard to believe that the United States, and here we're talking about the CIA, would provide that kind of information. I think that the administration has to know that killing Putin could have potentially catastrophic consequences. I mean, this is just something you don't want to do. So I actually find it hard to believe that we were behind this. With regard to Trump's statement that he didn't know anything about this issue, at first blanch, I find it hard to believe. But then when you think about how dysfunctional the Trump administration is, it's really not that surprising. I mean, this does look like the gang that can't shoot straight. And given that basic fact, it is possible that he just didn't know about it. It's shocking, but nevertheless possible.
Yeah, I mostly agree with Mearsheimer here. He said that this has become an administration that's known for one that can't shoot properly, but I think there's really a good explanation for that, and that's that Trump's cabinet is pretty split on foreign policy matters like Ukraine in terms of the non-interventionists, the Witkoffs and Bowlers of the world, compared to the interventionists, the Rubios and used to be Waltzes of the world. So, you know, there's a clear reason for why Trump's attentions and maybe his impulses are bifurcated. He's getting different types of advice there. As far as Ukraine's attempt to assassinate Putin, whether or not the U.S. knew about it, Ukraine has tried to do that before, not only in the summer of 2024, but also in a drone strike on the Kremlin itself in, I believe, May of 2023. This was widely reported at the time, and Ukraine denied involvement, but it doesn't really make sense who else could have been behind it unless it was the U.S., and we know the U.S. was conducting and directing much more of the war than we ever knew before once that New York Times article came out a few months ago. So, what can I say? It seems like animosities have flared up with Russia, have flared up with Putin, and I think that can be explained by Trump's rhetoric. He's trying to position himself as a mediator and a negotiator, you know, saying out of one side of his mouth he wants peace, but in the other side he's still providing weaponry and intelligence to Ukraine, and he's speaking just like Joe Biden. This stuff is picked up in Russia. It's not like Russian intelligence can't get a hold of it, Putin and his subordinates can't see it. When Trump's saying, well, Putin wants all of Ukraine. That's the same kind of propaganda that led to increased U.S. intervention in Ukraine. It's still continuing. I hope it stops. I hope Witkoff can play a major role in ending it and securing a peace, but peace seems even farther away out than it was maybe a month ago. But what do you guys think? Do you think peace between Ukraine and Russia will be secured anytime soon? Let me know in a comment below. And like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.